Hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap. I'm Sam Rohrer, and I'm going to be joined again today by Isaac Crockett as we focus on a topic of enormous controversy in this nation and worldwide. That subject is homosexuality and the gay and lesbian lifestyle. Our program theme for today and next week's program is From Sexual Bondage to Spiritual Freedom, a True Story. The true stories of a man who has authored a book about his life entitled From Queer to Christ, My Journey into the Light. The LGBTQ movement, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, itself continues to change as the movement itself, in its effort to redefine human sexuality and reshape cultural norms surrounding marriage and human sexuality. Now, as time has moved along, the biblical definition of human sexuality has degenerated to the use of such bizarre terms as gender neutral or gender fluid, and where elected officials are recommending such legally unheard of proposals, such as permitting a person to go back and change their birth certificate to reflect a change in their biological birth sex to whatever they may feel most closely describes the sex they want to be. Within this often heated cultural, moral, and increasingly legal debate, there's also a great deal of confusion as societies, families, law enforcement, social services, and even the church has been forced to enter an arena that is unknown in our nation and to most societies historically. Yet, in the midst of this great controversy, there are answers and there is clarity. And today on this program and next week's, we'll engage this subject which has affected us culturally and personally for many people perhaps watching this program right now. Now, as we do on every program, we select culturally relevant issues, often surrounded with great controversy, and most often seemingly without answers. Yet on this program, we hold out that wonderful reality that there is no question, there's no issue. There is no problem that God's Word doesn't hold all of the answers and the pathway from confusion to clarity and from bondage to freedom. Now today on Stand in the Gap, we're going to hear the true life story of one man's experience as he entered the gay lifestyle, the emotional ups and downs of his decision as an adolescent growing up in a Christian home, and the realities and the horrors of the sexual bondage that he experienced in the homosexual lifestyle, but then the hope that he ultimately found in a new life of spiritual freedom because of Jesus Christ. Our guest is George Carneal, author of the book, From Queer to Christ, My Journey into the Light. Isaac, before I bring in our guest to this really critical topic we're discussing today, I want to go to you here first. You are a young dad, people can see. You have several young children. God may bless you with more, I don't know. But the cultural circumstance in which we live now that has such an emphasis on choose what you want to be when it comes to sexuality and gender, and we're bombarded on all sides, it's got to be a challenge, maybe a fear, for young parents. I just would like to hear from you at the moment. What challenges are you facing, sensing as you and your wife are now raising your children in a culture that says, throw out what the biblical model is and go with whatever you want, effectively?
Well, yeah, I have children who are range in age from pre-K to middle school, and I used to teach middle school and high school in the public schools. And what I have seen is even we homeschool our children, and yet there's still just a bombardment. In schools, of course, there's sex education for younger and younger kids, but even outside of that, just playing on the playground, just a neighborhood child talking, with our daughter, sometimes 4 or 5-year-old kids saying, oh, did you know 2 princesses can get married? My, friend of our family married another girl. We were just driving through the streets of our small town the other day, and there was all these rainbows out, and my kids, oh, look at all those neat rainbows, and those people, wearing funny hats and things. And so there was an opportunity for us to talk about, the gay pride parade and what was going on. And really what I see is that parents need to discuss this biblically with their children. We can't ignore it. We can't pretend like it doesn't exist, because if we don't talk to our children about it, starting at a young age, they're being bombarded with it right now. There's an over-sexualizing going on. Somebody's going to talk to them about it. You parents, grandparents, families, churches, we need to be addressing it with our children.
So you're saying, excuse me, even a suggestion we talked about before. I know you have a concern that your children and all children are being forced to grow up too fast, being over-sexualized, a real problem, and it's forcing parents into that. And ladies and gentlemen, actually on this program, on the next week's program, we're going to be talking with a guest about counsel for parents and grandparents on how to deal with this issue with your children. You're going to want to stay tuned for that. But stay with us. We're going to come right back in just a moment and talking to our guest, George Carneal, author of the book, From Queer to Christ, My Journey into the Light.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution. Educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Well, welcome back to Stand in the Gap in this most important topic we're dealing with today, homosexuality, or we're calling it from sexual bondage to spiritual freedom, a true story. And that man right now is with us, to George Carneal. I want to thank you for being with us on this program today and sharing just a portion of your story with our viewers on a most critical topic. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me on the show.
If I could, George, let's start here, and we'll just kind of progress on this topic on these two programs kind of from the beginning. You grew up in a Christian home. Matter of fact, your dad was a Baptist pastor, so you heard the biblical teaching and the model of God's design for marriage and human sexuality. If you can identify, how old were you and what was it in your early years that began to move you into an area where you were questioning God's design, which then later opened the door for you to actually step into the gay lifestyle?
Well, I was in first grade when I had found that I was attracted to a boy much stronger than I was to a little girl that I also thought was cute. And as I went on through elementary school, I just found that the attraction toward boys was growing more stronger than it was girls. So obviously there was a confusion because everything in my world was male-female. So I didn't understand where these feelings were coming from. And it was just a real struggle because at that time there wasn't the internet and people weren't out, or celebrities weren't coming out of the closet. It wasn't an issue that I even heard discussed in the public forum. So I was really left to my own devices, just trying to understand in my own mind, where are these feelings coming from and why am I saddled with this? I didn't ask for it. So moving in even into the church realm and actually hearing the word of God, there was an anger and a resentment that was starting to build because I felt I was already being condemned and hated by God for something that I didn't even ask for. So it really brought about a lot of confusion for me.
You know, as you talk about the confusion, I want to talk about the struggle you had as you grew, you know, from the community that you grew up in, the family and church that was your home, to saying, you know, I don't feel like this is me. I don't feel like this fits what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something better. And that struggle of, you know, how you ended up in the homosexual community. But even before we go there, how old were you? And I don't know if maybe it was when you came out or what, but how old were you when you realized, when you separated yourself from what you had grown up in, your parents' community, so to speak, and decided to go looking for a different community to be a part of?
Well, after I graduated high school, I had met a guy in another town although I had experimented with a little boy in my church, he and I were fourth and fifth graders, there was something about that that felt right. And later I would find out that he was gay. But when I met a guy in another town, it was the first time that he had even said to me, "Are you gay?" And it was the first time that I had to answer that question for myself. And I said, "Yeah, I think I am." And at that point, I had pretty much shut off anything having to do with God's word. For the first time in my 18 years, I was finally feeling what it was like for most heterosexuals who take for granted the idea of somebody desiring you, to feel loved, to feel desired. And it was an addiction that would eventually just take over, because it was something it was just so strong and powerful, and something I just craved badly.
So when that started to happen and that started to develop right there, the relationship and just this whole, you coming to yourself saying, this is where I'm at. Did you feel like you were purposely choosing to leave what your parents had taught you and to separate from that? How did that feel to you, what was going on there? And again, a lot of times you look back at it now and can kind of diagram it more than what you were going through just at the time walking through it.
Well, at the time, I wasn't thinking about anything from a spiritual perspective or an eternal perspective. All I know was that there was a disconnect somewhere in my life with men or with my male figures and my male peers, because I was bullied a lot. So to have a guy look at me in a positive way and to desire me and me to have these feelings of what it's like to supposedly be in love, it was something so new and so wonderful. And I wanted to just I wanted to just move into that direction and kind of feel it out. God was no longer really part of the equation for me, because I had heard so many mean-spirited Christians make such derogatory comments about homosexuals, and that God hates fags. God's destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because of the fags and the perverts and the sodomites. God created AIDS to kill homosexuals. Fags are going to hell. There's no hope. So I really had, I guess, just thought to myself, well, God doesn't want a relationship with me. And I told him, I walked out of a church one night and I actually looked up in the sky and I told God, I hate you. And that for me solidified it as far as I was concerned. There's no hope for me, so I will move headlong or straight forward into this life.
So George, going back then to where you were at that time, what were you hoping for? I mean, we know, Hollywood and television, even social media, they kind of give us this grand version of what sex and promiscuity is and homosexuality, and it's all totally off. It's not true the way Hollywood depicts it. But what were you hoping for when you started to find this acceptance in the homosexual community, when you started to realize, my attraction to same sex is accepted here, they understand me more? What were you looking for? And then now looking back at it, what did you actually find?
Well, going into it, I had no idea what to expect. All I know is that when I walked into a gay bar and I didn't see the stereotypical effeminate men that are portrayed in the media. I really saw good-looking men that you would never suspect were gay. It was really an eye-opener for me, and to have guys look at you differently. Now, I didn't understand at that time. It's not the right kind of attention I needed. But for me, I was finally in a safe place. I was in an environment where men weren't mistreating or abusing me. And plus, I was having these feelings of love or lust at the time. It was just something new and exciting, and it was something that I wanted to explore. And I really didn't have the mindset of, I'm going to rebel against my parents. I'm not going to rebel against God. I was not thinking about that. I was trying to figure things out. And that really was the case for me. Just trying to find my way in this world and figure out, who am I? Am I a homosexual, a heterosexual? Can I find a man and settle down and have something solid and stable, find love? So that really was my mindset at the time.
So George, when you left, and Isaac asked you a question, did you know what you were looking to find at that point? You said you were seeking someone to simply love you, right? I mean, explain again, what were you looking for? What pulled you most strongly as you look back?
Love and acceptance. I needed to feel like I belonged somewhere. I just did not fit in with the heterosexual world. I did not fit in with my peers at school. My father, because of the demands of his ministry, he was gone a lot. I felt like there was a disconnect there. I know I was a somewhat effeminate as a kid, and I felt, well, maybe I'm a disappointment even to my parents. I had a lot of self-hatred, a lot of self-loathing. Um, I had such low self-esteem. I just did not see any value in my life. And so to walk into a situation where things are so different, and I feel like I'm valued to some degree, even though it was the wrong kind of attention, I couldn't see anything else. That's all I knew. It's like this feels so much better than feeling like an outcast.
Can
And I
I,
just worked hard to make an extended family, so to speak.
George, you said you had an encounter with another young boy when you were young. I've never asked you this question before. I'm going to ask you now. Were you ever involved in an abusive relationship when you were a young child with an adult?
No, I think just the male peers and the abuse and the bullying, the physical assaults, the threats, one guy threatening to slit my throat. School was such a place of torment for me. So anytime a male showed me any kind of positive attention or affection, I was so hungry and so desperate to be treated like a decent human being. It really is painful to talk about, but there was just a disconnect there.
Well, I will tell you, I appreciate your willingness to share your story with our listeners, and I know it's not easy. It's not easy for us to talk about it either, but it's an important issue. And this next part may be even more difficult, George. But again, you shared it with us on our Stand in the Gap Today radio program, we did a couple of weeks ago. But I want to ask you this. To the extent that you are able and willing, when you got into the lifestyle, you went to California, I think, at some point. Where did you go? And describe a little bit, if you could, what you actually found. Was it the glamour? Was it the wonderful athletic sports-looking guy with alcohol in his hand at the edge of the pool? What did you find? Because I think people need to hear what you actually found, George.
Well, I was in Florida when I came out, and I spent 3 years in the bar scene there. And within 3 years, after having numerous encounters with men and battling drugs and alcohol at this point, struggling with depression, I had become a male prostitute in Fort Lauderdale. I was just merely trying to survive. I had a scary encounter, and at this point, I really wasn't in contact with my family. And my father called me out of the blue and said, "It's time to come home." And I was already so depressed and suicidal at that point, I didn't even argue, and I went home. I eventually would attempt suicide, and then the path would take me where I met a guy in Nashville, and we eventually became boyfriends, but we moved to Los Angeles. And after 7 years of being with him and still not finding peace in that life, I moved back into the Los Angeles club scene, and it just went downhill from there.
I think people maybe who are watching right now may look, or they may be hearing this and saying, well, boy, what a story. And what you've shared would be new. But there may be some would say, well, that's just George. Mm-hmm. And that's what George experienced. But that's not what everybody experiences. Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, to what extent was what you just explained, what you experienced, is that typical for those who are a part of the gay lifestyle?
It is the norm. There are those who will say, well, that's not my life. Well, they are the exception. The norm, and I've been in bars all across this country and in several places around the world. I spent 25 years in that life. The LGBT community is really fraught with a lot of addictions. There's a lot of trauma that needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, we all are trying to medicate and work our way through this pain that we're feeling. And it may take the form of drugs, alcohol, pornography, getting in the porn business, multiple promiscuity. I saw so many casualties in that life from, murder, drugs, drug overdoses, suicide, AIDS, and there's so much depression and sadness, and what Hollywood portrays versus the reality of that life is so completely different. And that's why I speak out. It's not easy for me to talk about this stuff, but I want to say to the young individuals who think that going into that life, yeah, you're young, you look great, you're going to be the new meat on the market, and it feels good. But sin is only good for a season. As you start to grow old in the gay community, which is a very youth-oriented culture, you're going to find that your newness not only has worn off, but nobody really wants to have anything to do with you. It's very hard to find committed relationships. Even with men that I found who were in relationships for a significant amount of time, even slept around and had open relationships. And I know this also goes on in the lesbian community. And I'm not disparaging the LGBT community, because there's nothing that's going on there that isn't going on in the heterosexual world. But I'm just saying that life and that utopia that you think you're going to find at the end of the rainbow, I never found it. And I saw so much heartache in that community, and so many men just broken and hurting.
And ladies and gentlemen, you're hearing it from George Carneal, author of the book From Queer to Christ, My Journey into the Light. Stay with us. We're going to come back in just a moment, and we're going to hear from George how the prayers of his father helped him to come to the light.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of WBPH Philadelphia, positively different television. To watch archives of this program, go to WBPH.org.
Welcome back to the program, and we're talking with our good friend George Carneal. And George is opening up and talking to us about what many young people are going through, and many are going through exactly similar situation, not exactly the same, but a similar situation. Young people who have grown up in a Christian home and yet are struggling with conflict about sexuality, and in many cases, like with George, an attraction to the same sex. And so, George, you wrote in your book, From Queer to Christ, My Journey into the Light, that your father continued to pray for you, even at times where probably both of you didn't understand each other a lot. There was a lot of confliction going on for both of you. But can you share with us what the Lord did in His love and grace for you, and how the Lord brought you back from really addiction, from self-loathing, from attempting to kill yourself, from just a lifestyle of death, a death style, I guess, not a lifestyle, and how He brought you back into spiritual freedom, back into the light of Jesus Christ?
My father and I had cut communication with my family, and especially him, for 4 years. And one night I was actually contemplating suicide again. And parents need to hear this. There is power in prayer. And my father just called me out of the blue. And I was so broken and hurting so badly. I just really needed him, and I needed my family. And that really was the beginning, I think, of God starting to penetrate my heart and break me to the point of where I could no longer. I just needed to look at the reality of my life and where this was taking me. I was so miserable and suicidal all of the time. And my father was just diligent in his prayers. And I am lucky that I had family who didn't disown me. They still loved me. But I also had Christians who loved me and prayed for me as well. And they still told me the truth in God's love. They never talked down to me or berated me or treated me like a piece of garbage. They didn't see me as any worse as them. Our sin is all equal in God's eyes. So I knew that they were coming from a place of compassion. It was just going to take some time for me to have to work through, does God really want a relationship with me? Why would He love me? Is there any hope for me? And how am I going to walk away from a life that I know that has been my identity for 25 years, and possibly also grow old and be alone? And that was really the heart-wrenching, the most difficult part for me, of thinking that if God doesn't change my same-sex attraction, then I'm going to go the path of celibacy, but that also means I'm going to grow old and be alone. And that was very painful for me to think about.
And George, our time has come on this first program. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to a real story, a true story of one man's experience from sexual bondage to spiritual freedom. And you may be in that same position. We've talked about a little bit today, a little bit of hope. The next program, with next week's program, we're going to talk now about advice to parents. And we're going to talk to those who are actually in the lifestyle. Is there hope for them? Absolutely there is, just like George has shared. And that's the great aspect of the redemption of Jesus Christ. Hope in all cases. That's what we want to extend today. Truth about an important matter, but hope in Jesus Christ. Thank you for being with us today. Visit George's website. It's there, and speak to us. Visit our website. Let us know that you're watching and appreciating this program.